Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, the return of Brian Bales, not a Star Wars movie.
Very nice reference, though. The prequel would have been Lee Towns then, as last week.
Yeah. So welcome back.
Thanks.
Good to have you back.
Yeah.
And especially because we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, sacrifice.
Yeah. Sacrificial generosity. We've been in this year, if you've been in gathering the worship services or watching this, you know that our focus this year has very much been, as followers of Jesus Christ, to allow the Holy Spirit, if we're not already there, to take our relationships with Jesus from one that is transactional to transformative, meaning we're just not in this with Jesus for what we get or what we don't get, but that we work from him in that way. And so what we've been doing is we've been introducing you. At one point, the very beginning series, we did cadence, keeping in step with the Spirit, keeping in step with Jesus. We introduced you to some cadences or rhythms. We use those words pretty interchangeably, at least I know I do. And, and we just highlighted some of them. And if you haven't picked up on this yet, throughout this year, we're going to do small little mini series on each of these rhythms. We just finished one on storytelling before we did Haggai. We got a little bit of a peek preview into the idea of prayer last week. We're going to do a series on prayer coming up this year. And so we've highlighted those rhythms, and we're now starting a series on one of those 7 rhythms that we believe if we can learn to live from them, that will help us be transformed instead of just transactional, is sacrificial generosity. And there's probably, I can't think of a subject maybe that would get people immediately on edge or immediately uncomfortable or immediately tense than when we talk about sacrificial generosity. So we say this every time, that we hope that you have had the opportunity to watch whatever happened on Sunday, whether it's me or anyone else communicating on Sunday, before you gather here. But we also recognize that that doesn't always happen. And so there's something I need you to hear from me today, assuming that you've not heard Sunday, because I think it's really important. On behalf of myself, John, who's a leader here at church, and so many other Christian leaders, I'm so sorry and confess and repent towards those times where this topic of sacrificial generosity has been used as a hammer or has been used as a weapon somehow to make you feel guilt or shame. That is not God's heart around sacrificial generosity. And I think whenever we begin to talk about it in the church, there's so many of us, myself included, who've been on the other end of that. And so as soon as we hear this topic, we're checking out, either physically, mentally, or if you're watching online, we're just turning it off. Because of that. That is not God's heart. And so please hear me. That is not how it's supposed to be. And if I can ask for forgiveness for those people, I would. I can't. But know that that is not God's design. I also want you to know this. Anytime we talk about sacrificial generosity, especially from a church standpoint, when we talk about your talents or your time or your financial resources that God has entrusted you with, you realize that many times when that is spoken, the primary or the most obvious beneficiary of, if you're giving of those things, is the church. And so talking about sacrificial generosity seems very self-serving from a church's standpoint. John, I've talked about this over the last 20-some years. I didn't do it on Sunday, but one of the things I used to do is when I would talk about this and I would talk about it seeming self-serving, I would actually tell people, I know some of you know what kind of car I drive. Some of you may listen today and think, oh, we're supposed to be sacrificial generous. I wonder what car he's going to drive, right? And I would talk about what cars I did drive or didn't drive. And the reason that I did that wasn't necessarily to self-justify, but I realized there's so many people out there who have used this idea of sacrificial generosity intentionally and some unintentionally for their own personal gain or their personal benefit. And so for that, if you've ever been on the end of that, please, from our heart here at CFC, that is not our heart. That is not God's desire. That is nothing about that that's God's design. Because sacrificial generosity doesn't make sense lots of times, at least from an earthly perspective.
Yeah.
And so it's complicated enough even before we add these other things that are broken into that.
Mm-hmm.
And because of those complications, I've seen it happen in my own life, I've seen it happen in other people's lives, we often take the baby, sacrificial generosity, and throw it out with the bathwater,
Yeah.
right? And I want you to hear my heart. I said this on Sunday, repeated today. Just because something is complicated, or just because something has been, frankly, abused or used inappropriately by someone,
Yeah.
doesn't mean that that something is ungodly. It doesn't mean that that something isn't good. In fact, sacrificial generosity is so godly, and sacrificial generosity is so good. And the truth is, the greatest beneficiary of any sacrificial generosity is not the church. It's not God. He doesn't need it. But it's you or me. Now, there's a little catch there. I know you or me, we are the church. But you know what I'm saying in that differentiation there.
Yeah.
And so that was a little bit longer recap than we normally do about that issue. And what we did on Sunday is we didn't even get into the idea of, let's look at the scriptures that talk about sacrificial generosity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty much going to assume you can look them up yourselves, or that you might have known them. You've been on the end of the hammer, or you've been on the end of the guilt of those. They're there, right? They speak for themselves. What we really tried to do this week is speak into what I believe to be some principles that if we're able to grasp these other scriptural principles, then living out sacrificially becomes easier. Still not the easiest,
Yeah.
but becomes easier in that way. And so it's sort of the principles behind the principles in some ways. That if we're struggling, with something over here, it's much more difficult to do it over here. So that was kind of the heart of Sunday, and that was a very long beginning, but just wanted you to hear that.
But necessary.
Yeah.
Because this has been mishandled. It has been abused. And in some cases where people want to make sure that it's not mishandled or abused, it's just not been talked about at all.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point, because I'm not a person that in general feels nervous about communicating at all, about anything from Scripture. But if there's one that I think the most, John as a teacher, you know this, when you're having this inner dialogue where you're having this outer dialogue
Mm-hmm.
going on, where you're just trying to make sure that the words that you say or whatever it might be are really tight and really precise. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a control issue for me lots of times, because the Holy Spirit is much more powerful than my words.
Sure.
So if even you heard on Sunday, or you're now going to go back and hear Sunday, and you hear something that for you seems like a guilt hammer or a shame hammer, please know that wasn't my heart. It just wasn't. Or it seems a way that's self-serving. That's not my heart. And so that's, I think, why a lot of people, because it's a challenging line to walk in the midst of this, have chosen either to go to one extreme or the other. I'm just going to talk about it every week and use it inappropriately, or I'm not going to talk about it. And when you don't talk about it, you rob the opportunity of people to grow and be transformed by Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And that really is the goal of this series on sacrifice, is it's for us to be transformed through learning how to, through engaging in, through participating in the act of sacrifice.
Yeah.
And we were talking offline before we hit record, and I told you as I was putting these notes together, I'm worried that this is going to feel pokey,
Mm-hmm.
because there's no way to talk about the practical application of the rhythm of sacrificial generosity than to talk about sacrificing.
Yeah, and one of the things that you actually discover about all of these rhythms, but probably the one that seems most risky from our perspective, I think if I could use that term risky, you think that'd be a fair term, is that none of these can be actually transformative just in our head.
Nope.
Right? It's not just an intellectual pursuit. In fact, we've talked about this offline together. I don't know if we've actually talked about this in the podcast, but we've certainly talked about it on Sunday before. If you're part of Christian Fellowship Church, we identified just us as a church 3 to 4 years ago now. It just seems the other day, but it was a little bit ago, where we as a church were really, really good at intellectually saying, yes, this is true, but we weren't nearly as good in actually doing the things that we said are true.
Yeah.
There is no possible way with any of these rhythms, but especially in sacrifice, to learn the rhythm and the goodness of God around sacrificial generosity without stepping into a moment where you have to be sacrificially generous.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah.
I like that term pokey, though. Pokey.
It's got something.
Yeah, it's got something.
And so what we want to do today, as we always want to do, is to make this practical, to make this applicable, to bring our faith forward. And you can teach something you haven't lived, but it's not as powerful as teaching something that you have. And so I think one of the things that people sometimes forget, I didn't used to forget this until I came to work at a church, but this has been as challenging for us as anybody else who walks through these doors and isn't employed by the church. Yeah. Right? God has called us to sacrifice. And again, when we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but usually when we hear this, we feel like we're specifically talking about money. And it's not. And a lot of your stories actually are not specifically money driven. They're around the periphery,
sure,
but it's actually places where God has called you to sacrifice in other categories that are just as valuable and just as meaningful.
Here's a little heads up. I'm probably talking about this a little bit next week, and so don't turn away from next week. But next week we're going to talk about what it looks like to be sacrificially generous with my time. That is, for some of us, you love to be just doing stuff all the time. For me, I've discovered that is actually one of the big things, what it looks like to be sacrificially generous with my time, especially if I've already sort of thought this is what I was going to do with my time.
Yeah.
This is my downtime. This is this, and all of a sudden my neighbor needs something, or someone at church calls me, or whatever.
Right.
I mean, so it isn't just about, and that's this idea of being sacrificially generous. We have taken it accidentally, I think, and made it very, very small.
Yep.
Right? But it's much larger than that. And we're going to dive into that and dig into it a little more.
And so we're going to start just with what happens when we start to live this life.
Yeah.
So often we talked about as people come to learn that God is still a conversational God, that he wants to communicate with his children, that quite often one of the things that causes people to initially pull back is the fear that, if I start listening to God, he's going to tell me to get into ministry, or he's going to tell me I have to go be a missionary in some, completely forgotten part of the world where there's no internet and there's no cell phones, and I'm not going to know the language, and I'm not going to know the people, and I'm just, right? That if I trust God with my life, if I trust God with my money, my time, my talent, whatever, that it's not going to go well for me.
And so even in just saying this, what we've illustrated, intentionally or unintentionally, is a belief in a truth that really isn't a truth.
Yeah.
How many times do we use the terms my blank?
Yeah.
Right? And it is such a challenging but true statement from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We don't belong to us, right? When we become believers of Jesus Christ, we belong to God, right? Thank goodness he's a gracious master. And so some people are like, oh, well, maybe I should have, not professed Jesus Christ because then I belong to myself. Well, here's the catch. Romans tells us when we weren't followers of Jesus Christ, we didn't belong to ourselves either.
Yeah.
Instead, we belonged to a different master that was much less gracious, not good, not kind, and that is sin. So the truth is, we like to think through the words my and mine a lot, but it's not true. And there's probably nothing that would inflame the spirit of a good old American person than telling them they're not independent. And I just spent some time, one of the reasons that I wasn't here on Sunday while Lee spoke, and I love it to be here when other people speak, is I was away celebrating my anniversary with my wife. And so many of you longtime listeners know that John, in his previous life, was a history teacher. He was actually the head of the history teaching department that my wife also worked in. So they share a love of history, and I enjoy history too. We went to Charlestown, right? And so we were in South Carolina, and we went through all these places that go through the history of just the awful things that we have done as human beings to enslave other human beings, right? And so the very concept in the United States to say, you don't belong to you, for some has even a greater sense of, what do you mean? And so when we dive into this, if we can accept this fact that we don't belong to ourselves, and by the way, that's a good thing, because we belong to the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, all-present God of the universe, who wants to put that to work for us. That's actually so much better than anything we could ever think. But, there are these moments where, John, you have this statement that we use a lot together. I don't know how many times we've been on the podcast now, But it's this: your feelings will always tell you the truth about what you believe, right? And as we were talking, I think as you think about taking our faith forward is when we think about sacrifice, one of the lies that we often believe when it comes about our feelings is that it has to feel good in order to be good.
Yeah.
Especially when we're stepping into this. So I want us to just consider this, that for most of us, if we're just stepping into sacrificial generosity, there's a high chance it's not going to feel good.
Yeah.
Maybe another term is feel comfortable, right? If you like that term, right? But for even those people who have stepped sacrificially into generosity with their time or whatever it might be, or their resources, God's always about stretching us and making us more like Jesus. So many times, God's about, okay, well, now let's take it one more step. Yeah. And so even if maybe sacrificial generosity has been part of your life for many, many years, it's a good chance God may call and stretch you a little bit. And that was a little bit of the video that we showed on Sunday of Tony Bodinger, right? It's one thing to say, all right, God asked me to stretch and give some more of my time, or God asked me to stretch and give some of my talent, or God asked me to stretch and give more finances. She was asked by God to give a kidney, right? You don't get extra kidneys, right? Yeah. I mean, at least not easy. I guess you could purchase one on the black market, but that's for a different podcast, right? But you don't get that.
Yeah.
And that's a level of stretch. And I was like, I remember the first time I heard that story, I was like, some of my complications in life started flaring up in me. Like, God, what would I do if you do that? So I say that to remember that lie, and to also say this, that God is a God of process. He understands you're in process. He understands we're in process. And so as you continue to hear some things you're talking about, I don't really want you to begin to reflect on where you should be as much as where God is asking you just to go to next.
Yeah.
And trust him with the destination, because he's kind of good with that.
He is. And so that really is the first practical step, which we always try to do on this podcast, is how do we make this practical? The very first practical step is simply to be aware of your internal reaction to the idea of sacrifice, or the idea of God asking you to sacrifice, and just see what comes up, right? See what comes up with the idea of God asking you to begin to sacrifice in the area of finances. And I intentionally didn't say my finances, right? But what comes up? Is it the feeling that God's going to hang me out to dry? Is it the feeling that there won't be enough, right? Is it the feeling that wherever I give it to, it will be so misused that it would just be better if I decide where it's going to go?
Yeah.
Right? And not just with money, but with time or with talent, right? God tells me I need to go volunteer over there. I don't know if I trust that organization. I'm going to go do it over here, right? God tells me to go help these people. I don't know if I want to help those people. They don't seem like the kind of people that deserve help. It doesn't seem like they've done enough to get themselves to where they should be first. Right? Like notice what comes up when we start to consider the idea of inviting God into the space where he's supposed to be, right? That this isn't inviting God into some place where we don't generally, we don't generally invite him in sometimes, but this isn't a space where God's not supposed to be. This is absolutely the space where God belongs because it's his.
Yeah. And, in each of those things that you brought up, in that moment where you talk about fear or how it's going to be mismanaged, whatever, there's something in there that the enemy wants you to believe.
Yeah.
Right. And I was processing that a little while back. By a little while, I mean 30 minutes ago, but maybe a little bit longer than that. When asking, why is it some things come up in me in that way? And one of the things is this idea for me is when I struggle with sacrifice, it really comes to this idea, am I going to wind up still being in need if I do this? I've never, ever, not that I might recall, not been a hoarder. That my tendency is to hoard anything, time, vacation, whatever it might be, that if I give it away, that somehow or another, that the God of the universe who asked me to give it away isn't going to provide me with more. And, one of the stories, since we were thinking about that, because, I think, again, sometimes people tune in and they see John or they see me, and it's really easy to believe this lie that we have all our stuff together or that we don't struggle with any of these things. And this would be a really easy one to think about. But I went back and remember I've told God two things in life. and never tell God things. They're always funny. I've always said this. I would never be a pastor, and I'd never move back to Ohio. Well, I did move back to Ohio at some point, and certainly I'm a pastor. I'm not sure what the Ohio thing was about, but I do know what the pastor thing was about. I grew up a pastor's kid, and from my perspective, which I believe was a wrong perspective at the time, sure, we were in need all the time. All the time. You know, I would play the comparison game, right? And comparison is the theft of joy to other people and what I thought they had and what that is. You know what it's like, you know, social media, look around the neighborhood, whatever it might be. And we just didn't have that, right? When I went to college, you know, my abilities and my necessities of what I had to do for me didn't always match what I thought other people had help doing. And a lot of times I attached that to what my family had chosen to do for so long. And in my mind, I felt like, oh, great. We sacrificed and we served and we did this for so many people. And the reward for that, now I never put it together until later on, was I don't have this, I don't have this, and I don't have this, and my life is much more difficult. Now, a lot of lies in that. But what really popped up in that is that, so now when God says, okay, Brian, I want you to be a pastor, all I could think of was all the negative things that would happen. Not that God of the universe loves me and he's not going to ask me to do anything that's not for his glory and my good. It was just, all these bad things are going to happen. All these difficult things are going to happen. And so in that way, what it really revealed in me is my heart towards God. And we've used this term before. Some of you may be familiar with it, some may not. It was like the heart of an orphan. Mm-hmm. That instead of considering myself to be a son of the God of the universe, I functioned much more towards God like I was an orphan and he was a foster parent. Yep. That I was always going to run out, that I always had to earn more, and that if I gave up my little hoard of time or talent or money or whatever it may be, there was no guarantee that I was ever going to be blessed for more. Right? And so, and I don't know if some of you resonate with this or not, but man, that's where I was from for so long. Yeah. And I'll say this, I've been a pastor for 25 years now, and that struggle isn't like gone. Yeah. I don't struggle with it in the same way that I used to, but it's not like all of a sudden that, you know, God hasn't asked blank for a sacrifice. And I think to myself, oof, I know one of them just came to mind immediately, so I'll share with you, is like, go help these people, right? And like, well, you should want to help people because you're a pastor. Yeah, we should all want to help people if they're pastor. But I know there's been times where I've went and helped people and it's done no difference. And I thought to myself, that wasted my time. Yep. I could have been spending my time with my family. Yep. And instead I did all of this and nothing happened. That seemed like a bad thing, even though God had asked me to do it. And so in that moment, my belief is that God isn't going to redeem that time. Right. That he asked me to put over here that from my limited perspective didn't do what I thought it should. Right. With my family. Yep. But he will. Yeah. In that way. So no matter where you are, think about those things that are coming up and what the enemy wants you to believe here. And for me is that God isn't going to replace or give me more of what I give away. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But he owns cattle on 1,000 hills. 1,000 days. You know, has 1,000 days of one with him. I always get that verse mixed up. But he's got it all, right? He can do any of that, yet it struggled to live from that. Yeah. And one of the things that I love about everything that you just said, and there was a lot, but one of them is the problem here wasn't a lack of scriptural knowledge. None. Right? The problem wasn't, well, you just didn't know that every good and perfect thing comes from, this was a heart-level reality that was overriding head-level knowledge of who God was. And that's the challenge for all of us. And so the most practical thing that we can begin to do in this area of sacrifice is discover what we believe at a heart level, not at a theological level. Yeah. And by the way, it can start really early. The enemy doesn't care, by the way. He doesn't care if you're a kid. There's a whole lot of things that I started believing lies about the world that I was experiencing very early that I never verbalized. Yeah. That I never came out and said, hey, is this true? I just started accepting them and began to frame a whole lot of things. And so while we're not trying to sit in here and say, you know, hey, let's all dig into our childhood. But at the same time, let's all dig into our childhood. It started somewhere. It had to start somewhere. And my guess is if you're near the ages that we are, it didn't start yesterday. Right. It didn't. Yeah. It didn't. Yeah. And so whatever your lived experience is, however reality has told you,
through your life story that this is what's true, it can also start to feel like, well, I have to get myself out of this. And I love that you referenced that verse in Romans 6. It's one of my favorites when we get to this idea of how do we find freedom and how do we reconnect to God as the source of life and provision and all of that. Because that verse in Romans, it's 6:16, don't you realize that you become the slave of whatever you choose to obey? You can be a slave to sin, which leads to death, or you can choose to obey God, which leads to righteous living. And here's the cool thing about this, and I didn't discover this until about a month and a half ago. That word obey, which gets used 3 times in that verse, depending on your translation. If you dig into the Greek there, the word for that is literally submission to what is heard. Obedience as the response to someone speaking. And if you're looking at Strong's Concordance, which is where I pulled this from, this refers both to an earthly voice, either another human being, or in this case, the liar, and the Lord's voice. This is the thing that encapsulates what we've talked about so many times in so many different places, the war of words.
Yep.
That God says one thing, this is all mine. I'm going to take care of you. Look at the sparrows and the lilies of the field. I've got you.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry. And Satan says he's going to hang you out to dry. You will never have enough. You will always be hungry. You will go destitute unless you take this for yourself, right? It's the same lie he told to the angels when they rebelled against God in Revelation 12. And it's the same lie he told to Adam and Eve in the garden in Genesis 3. Unless you take this for yourself, unless you take matters into your own hands, you will never have enough. You cannot trust God's heart for you.
And I think that for some of you, if you've stayed with us this long, because I'm very aware that for some of us right now, you've already turned it off, right? This is such a massive area of a stronghold, maybe is a term to use, but just this big wall that has been built up for a multiplicity of reasons. But from the very beginning, the enemy is about telling you something that isn't true. And reframing an experience in a way that casts God into a light that isn't true. And so asking God in these moments, I think for many of us, about this experience or this or whatever it might be. And so I think back to some of the thought processes that I had around why I grew up the way that I grew up. I had to go back and ask God what was true in that moment versus what I believed in that moment. And it was unbelievably powerful when God started to share with me what was true. Some of it was, yes, we did have challenges and difficulty, but I was placing blame inappropriately. Others of it was what I viewed as challenge and difficulty was actually blessing. Blessing. Because it made me someone more like he wanted me to be. Right? And so if you're in this moment and you've had that, knowing that the enemy is going to come in and he's going to try to ask God what is true. Real practical. That moment, that thing that you're believing, because you have one. I know you do. I know you do. If you exist, you have one. At least one, if not 100. Right? Ask him what is true. And he promises, Hebrews promises, says this, come boldly in Hebrews chapter 4 to the throne of grace and find mercy and help in your time of need. And asking God what's true is a question of need. God, I need to know what's true. He will give you an answer. And if you're struggling and feeling like you're hearing an answer or those sort of things, John and I, both, one of us, we would love to walk alongside or find someone else to partner with you to walk alongside. A little early plug, but you can just email us here at faithforward@cfcwired.org.
Yeah, we'd love to, honestly. And so that is step one. And whether we get to help you with that or whether that's something you and God process on your own, if you don't feel like sacrificing, there's a reason. Do you know what it is? And ask God, invite him into that space. Right? And then the second most practical thing that we can do with this topic of sacrifice is to stop talking about sacrifice and do it. That there is no way other than experientially for this to change in our life. Right? You can read any number of books if you want to. You can dig into the significance of any number of other words in the Greek or the Hebrew or the Aramaic, have at it, but you will not fundamentally begin to change in this area of trusting God with your time and talents and resources until you start trusting God, however small it may seem, with your time and your talents and your resources.
Mm-hmm.
It cannot happen any other way. You look at the way that God deals with Abraham and his invitation to Abraham to take his son, his promised child, Isaac, up onto a mountaintop and sacrifice him. And, there's ways to read that scripture where it just feels like, man, God sucks.
Yeah.
God is just a mean kid with a magnifying glass that likes to fry people from time, right? There's a way to read it that way. But there was also the realization that for Abraham, he had waited for this child for so long that he probably would have moved heaven and earth on his own to make sure that nothing ever happened to him. And God saw that that was actually going to be detrimental to Abraham's life and Abraham's relationship with God, because if you put Isaac up that high, you know who eventually gets put beneath Isaac?
Yeah.
Is God.
And we don't like to use words like this because they feel ancient and not applicable, but there's a word for anything that you put above God. It's a big 4-letter word called idol.
Yeah.
And that idol could be Isaac. That idol could be your sense of security, my sense of security. That idol could be your sense of significance that comes when you step into something that he asks. It could be anything. And the vast majority of times, listen, we're always talking about pop culture. It doesn't look like the little Inca doll on the Brady Bunch, right? I mean, if you're old enough, you get that reference, or else you just Google it, right? That idol doesn't look like that. If it did, we would run kicking and screaming. Right? The enemy is way too intelligent in the Western world to present those to us in that way. Now, he does it differently in different parts of the world. Yeah. But in our part of the world, if we saw that, we would run. Right? So he's very good at taking things that we think are good, right, and putting them above God and making them an idol. You know what I love about the story about Abraham too is it was a process again, and even in the process, he messed up. He messed up. There's not once but twice during his life journey he messed up in trusting God when it came to saying who his wife was.
Yeah.
Apparently Sarah was very attractive, and not once but twice when he went into new lands, the king of that land saw his wife and wanted to take her as one of his wives. Well, God had promised Abraham that he was going to have an inheritance and all of this. Mm-hmm. Yet, he felt threatened that if he said, hey, this is my wife, he was going to get killed, because that actually happened a lot. Mm-hmm. Oh, you have a pretty wife. I'm the person in power. I'm going to kill you. Take her for myself. Yeah. And so in that moment, twice, Abraham tripped up. I don't say that to glorify the tripping up. What I am saying is that no matter who you are, even Abraham, it's process. Yeah. And sometimes as we step into this, we have this opportunity to trust God and to sacrifice in that way. And in this case, Abraham's sacrifice was truth. Yeah. Right? Am I willing to trust God with speaking truth and whatever the consequences are? And we may trip up. And if we do, know this, that the grace of God is still abundant in your life. Yeah. God didn't kick Abraham to the curb. He didn't all of a sudden say, none of my promises are real. Yeah. And so it is that way. And we look at, I mentioned some on Sunday, we look at, just about anyone I could think of that we look at in Scripture and say, man, they did some amazing things. I can't think of any of them that there's not at least a moment, if not many moments, where you see God stretching them in some ways to eventually then get there. Yeah. Reminding us again that it's a process. Yeah. And so if you struggle with the sacrificial generosity, you're not alone. But also the temptation might be, now I've heard what is said and I feel guilty and I feel shame for all the times I haven't been. So now I'm going to make up for it all of a sudden really quick. Don't do that, right? Ask God what he wants. Because what's so interesting about this tension around sacrificial generosity is God doesn't need it. Right. He doesn't need it, but he understands it as a necessity for transformation in us. Yeah. We're the ones that need it. Yeah. And so ask him what it looks like.
Yeah, it's not about the stuff. It's about the heart.
Yeah.
And that's what he's after. And again, it's one of those things that Satan has been so proactively fighting against, is our understanding of what God is really after and what God is really going to do. That we're so convinced that it's just going to be a whole bunch of taking away. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a whole bunch of stripping down. It's going to be a whole bunch of removal. It's going to be a whole bunch of deficit. And it's not. I mean, there's so much in the scriptures where God talks about reward. And this isn't a, name it and claim it that God wants everybody to be rich and drive Italian sports cars. But God has so many good things in store, not just tangible, but so many redemptive, transformational things internally as well as in and through us that's really what he's after. And so, of course, that's what the enemy would set himself against.
And I think as we talk about that, I love that you brought out this truth that God blesses our obedience. Mm-hmm. However, you also identified that sometimes the blessing looks a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so if you find yourself, right, and this is another way that I think Scripture has been abused.
Yeah.
When people say, if you give of your time, or if you give of this, or give it, they make it formulaic. I've literally heard pastors abuse Scripture and say, well, you can't outgive God. Whatever you give, God's going to give you back, and then they'll name a number, right? They'll name a number. There's nothing in Scripture that says that. It says God blesses those, and he will take care of you, but it might not look exactly like we think, because part of this process is in transformation is to help us understand that contentment and peace only has one true source. Yeah. And that's Paul when we talked in Philippians, right? Because if I understand, and that's a big if, the most likely financial scenario of Paul and status scenario of Paul and time scenario of Paul pre his conversion, he was probably well off.
Seems like
he was definitely above average from the teachers that he had and his status position and all the things, right? Now, he follows God. He sacrificed these things. And when he writes in the book of Philippians, I've learned from whatever content, because it's I can do all things through Christ. That means Christ gives me what I need so I can obey him. He's writing it from prison. And this is house arrest. But I love how, like, sometimes when people like house arrest, like that's not a big deal. Okay, this isn't a country club, right? House arrest, house arrest in Rome in AD 60 to 62, which is about when Ephesians was written somewhere, was still Rome house arrest. I mean, it wasn't like, someone just slapped a little ankle bracelet on you and said, go whatever you want. Right. It was not a pleasant scenario. But he's reminding us that as we go, God still gave him what we needed. And I think the temptation or the lie that the enemy wants to put in many times is that, Brian, you need this amount of money in your bank account to have peace and contentment. Yeah. Or you need to have this much amount of time or this much this, right? And that's not true at all. Yeah. Not true at all. The contentment comes from Jesus. And if I find my contentment in Jesus, sometimes he gives me more money in my bank account. Yeah. Sometimes he doesn't. Yeah. But it's kind of one of those scenarios, and I don't know if this is a good example or not, but I'm going to just use it anyway. There was a famous scene in the movie where a guy's trying to get over a girl. And the other guy looks at him and says, well, if you want her back, what you need to do is you need to get over her. And he goes, so what I need to do is I need to pretend to get over her, and then she'll want me back. He goes, no, you actually have to get over her. And then he goes, so I have to get over her, so when she comes back, I won't want her. He goes, yes, and there's the rub. The attachment, you're like, how does that apply to this? When we actually want the presence of God and get contentment from him and him first, it's not a means to an end. I'm going to pretend to want him so I get this finance. I'm going to pretend to want him so I get this status. I'm going to pretend to want him to get this. No, it's when you actually want him, you don't care about those other things. Yep. And you may or may not get them, but it actually won't matter. It won't matter. And I know that's really hard to grasp because it just seems so counterintuitive and so complicated. But there's the rub. So don't ever get into this thinking, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pretend what I really want is God. But I'm going to want God so I can get this. Right. The reward for wanting God, hear this, is God himself. That's the reward. Yeah. Sometimes it comes with other stuff. Sometimes it doesn't. But those other stuff doesn't make the reward of God better in any way, shape, or form. It's just how he decides in that point to love us. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the fundamental flaw in the guaranteed financial transaction with God. Like, if I give 100, he's going to give me 30, 60, or 100 fold back. Yeah. Then my comfort and my joy isn't in God. It's in the math. That's right. And if the day ever came where God didn't, I don't suddenly have comfort and joy with God. No. And again, there's an intellectual understanding of those things, and there's a heart level reality. And for some of us, there's the, okay, well, I want to dip my toe in the pool. And that's actually okay. God is fine with that, right? This is one of the few places in the scriptures in the book of Micah where God says, test me on this.
He does.
And that's not through the guilt and shame of you haven't been doing it, and so make up for all the lost time, which again, the fitness equivalent would be you haven't worked out in a year, so go to the gym for 5 hours one day. Yeah. Right? That would be ludicrous. That would be so unkind to yourself. And not only would it be unkind, but it would actually set you further back.
Yeah.
Because you wouldn't be able to go exercise again for God knows how long.
Yeah.
Right? You would actually have hurt yourself and done damage to what you would actually hope to achieve. And so part of what we have to remind ourselves is that God is a God of process. God has invited us to test him here and allow him to prove that he's faithful. And he's okay with slow. I was really having a hard time trusting God with my money when my wife and I got together, and she had already been faithfully tithing. And when we combined our finances, she had said, I really want to do this. And I was like, I don't know that I do.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we were at a point in our relationship with God where we were able to feel like we could pray and get a response that we could trust. And it felt like God said, I want you to start tithing, which we took as 10%. And so we started doing that, but I decided I'm going to put my stamp of approval on this. I'm not going to give to a church. I was coming here at the time. Sorry, CFC. They seem like a big church. They probably don't need my money.
Sure.
So I'm going to give it to good organizations that are doing good things that need. So I'm still giving, God, and I'm giving to your people writ large, but I'm keeping my hands on the reins here. And he was gracious enough to allow me for a time to get accustomed to the giving of the amount, and then did bring me to a point of correction of, that's not actually what I want you to do, right? Like I'm pretty clear here on this, that there's a place where you should give, and by the way, there are people in need, right? That there is tithing and there is giving, and it was an incredibly redemptive process for me, very much like the movie example that you gave of. He brought me to the point where the thing that I had held so dear in my life because of my own background, growing up as a kid, there was a stint where we were in, affordable housing. And there was a stint where we were living in a trailer park. And I loved where we were then, but I was also painfully aware of our lack. And I was aware of, as a middle schooler, feeling uncomfortable with people coming to my house. And it's just like, there were things that were internalizing already at that point of, there are things that I never want to feel ever again. And so, of course, I got into the high-paying profession of public education.
Only to trade out for the next high-paying working.
There's been some flaws in the plan along the way.
Yeah, exactly.
But right, that and again, that's another maybe helpful thing, is that didn't change the way that I still tried to hold on to the thing. I didn't make career moves towards, lots of money, but the money I had, I held until God brought me to a place of seeing that it wasn't what I thought it was, and he wasn't who I had thought he was. And when he redefined both who he was and what money was to me, I get to now live in a way that is still not totally free of challenge, but it's free in a way that I never thought I would get to be. And so for some of us, the invitation is just, what's the next step? What would it look like to dip your toe in here with sacrifice?
He's inviting us to experience it with him. And I love that example of graciousness because, John and I both said this several times in this podcast. Both of us, I said, I won't speak for John, I'll say it's for me. I don't have a control problem. I have a sin problem that shows up with control. But we talk about control. Even in that process, he trusts me with the money, now trusts me to be in control, right, of that. Because it's a little by little in that way. And so, there's a thing as we get near the end of our time together today that you wrote down that I loved about that sometimes God has to remove something that's in the place that's occupying that he wants to put in there to actually experience that freedom, right? And I immediately had this meme that we've talked about at least once before that I saw where this, it's a picture of European Jesus. Looks a bit like this. That's not what Jesus actually looked like. But he's bending down to a little kid who has this little teddy bear, right? You've seen that. And behind God has this much bigger teddy bear he wants to give. But right? And he's trying to say, you need both hands off this teddy bear to get this big one. And sometimes we don't get that we've got to release it. You made this note that I love this. Like, God, I'm not going to really trust you, God, with my finances until I have this much in the bank account.
Yeah.
Right? That's not how this works.
No. It can't work that way.
Notice what he said. This is not an option. It is impossible.
Yeah.
Right? Even as I ended on Sunday, the three principles that I try to bring about: you don't belong to you. God is different. He does things differently. That means he just has us do things that don't make sense to us. And he's the only place I don't believe you'll actually learn. It's impossible to learn sacrificial generosity unless you accept those things. Yeah. It can't work. And in the same way, if you find yourself hearing God's plan and saying, okay, but I want to tweak it a little bit and give it back to you. He has grace, right? He'll bring you along, right? Yeah. But it's not going to work the way that he wants it. And ultimately, it won't go there, right? It
won't do for you what you think it's going to do for you.
Yeah. Well, and actually, it was one of those things where near the end on Sunday, I wrote this, and when I wrote it, you have those moments where you're like, wow, God, that wasn't me, right? So if this sounds profound, I don't mean it to. It's because it's not for me, right? One of the reasons that it's complicated, right, and we don't have sacrificial generosity is that we feel like if we're sacrificial, we're not going to have a full life.
Yeah.
But interesting enough, what happens is when we let the complication wins, it actually results in having less than the full life that Jesus wants us to have.
Yeah.
The only way to have the full life is to be transformed. So the very thing we want, full life, is the very thing we're working against when we're not sacrificially generous.
Yeah.
It's counterintuitive. It doesn't work any other way. And that's why John and I could sit here and we could talk about the Greek or the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or whatever it might be, and give you all this head knowledge. But the truth is, that's all up here. It doesn't really work until we step into what God's asking us to be sacrificially generous in our life. And he knows what you might struggle with. You might struggle with a different area than I might struggle, or John.
Yeah.
But he wants to step into that area.
Yeah. So again, the two encouragements. If you're feeling fearful, insecure, angry, whatever about the idea of sacrifice, you feel that for a reason. Ask God where that came from.
Yep.
You can be obedient to the voice of the enemy. You can be obedient to the voice of God, but you can't be obedient to both. And so that's the most helpful place to start is, why do I feel what I feel? Because there's a reason. And the second part is, ask God where he's inviting you to step in. And maybe it's with a toe, and maybe it's with a whole foot, and maybe it's a cannonball. But ask him where he's inviting you to. You don't have to make up for this. This isn't yours to decide how you're suddenly going to be sacrificial so that God is happy with you and proud of you. Ask God how he wants you to begin to be sacrificial or more sacrificial, because all of us have more space to grow in this area. So this isn't just for those that aren't tithing or aren't serving. And if you are, then you're off the hook on this one. There's more. And that's actually a good thing. Mm-hmm. That's not punishment. It's not discipline. And again, notice what comes up with the idea of me saying, God might have more for you in this area. Think of how much more free you could be if you got to that next level of what the enemy has continued to tell you that you thought you were past. And as always, we're happy to be here and help. Mm-hmm. faithforward@cfcwire.org. Happy to share the journey as we've walked it so far and where God's still stretching us, because again, we're by no means done here.
Yep. As you were talking, I thought if we ever had an alternative name for this podcast, mm-hmm. I'd like There's More. We can look at that too. Yeah. Maybe podcast number 2, and all the extra more time that maybe God's not going to ask us to sacrifice and do. But I'm Brian.
I'm Jon, and we'll see you guys next time.